This video is in response to some of the counter-arguments that I've either personally received or seen on YouTube with regards to the words of Jesus found in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. Basically, many people have engaged in scripture twisting, interpretive gymnastics, or just your blatant denial of the obvious, all in their attempt to deny the very clear, plain reading of the scriptures. But before we begin answering some of these counter-arguments or false claims, I need to do two quick things to sort of lay the groundwork, so to speak. First of all, we need to remember that the Bible clearly states the fact that sexual relations outside of marriage are called the sin of fornication. So according to God in the Bible, sexual relations are to be confined to those individuals who have been joined together through a mutual commitment of holy matrimony. So what then is holy matrimony? And that brings me to the second thing that I want to do before we begin answering some of these false claims of the critics, and that is to take a look specifically, to read to you from Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6, because I don't want to assume that everybody knows exactly what those words are, and it also gives us Jesus' definition of real or true marriage as being that which exists between a man and a woman, a husband and a wife. And here's what Jesus said in those verses. First of all, he says, "In the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. And he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate." Now, the first and most common response that I get to this passage is that Jesus is only referring to divorce. And it is true that what prompted Jesus' words here was a question regarding divorce. And he answers that question when he says that the two shall become one flesh, and so they are no longer two but one, and what God has joined together, let not man separate. And in the process, he does reveal that marriage creates a spiritual bond or unity, and that it is God's ideal that a marriage be for life. But he also provides additional information here that we can't ignore. In fact, we need to take special note of. And this is not an uncommon thing for Jesus to do. He's often asked a question and then gives additional information. A perfect example of this is found in Matthew chapter 22, verses 36 through 40, where he's asked, what's the first and greatest commandment? And Jesus tells them that the first is that we love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, and mind. Then he goes on to give us the second greatest, which is to love our neighbors as ourselves. Nobody in their right mind would say, well, we don't have to love our neighbors because Jesus was only talking about the greatest commandment. That's what he was asked about, and that's what he tells us. We need to love God, so we don't have to listen to anything else that he has to say here. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 19, nobody can say, well, he's only talking about divorce, and therefore we're just going to ignore everything else he has to say. Rather, we need to listen to the very important additional information that Jesus gives us, and that is that marriage is between a male and a female, a husband and his wife. The second most common argument that I hear is found in verse 12 of this exact same chapter, Matthew chapter 19, where many homosexuals will claim that Jesus is providing an exception to heterosexual marriage when he talks about eunuchs, and some will even go so far as to say that a eunuch is a homosexual. Now, the first thing I'd mention here real quickly is that when Jesus talks about eunuchs, he never even remotely implies that he's providing an exception to heterosexual marriage at all. Secondly, we need to look at what a eunuch actually is, and it is not a homosexual. A eunuch is defined as a male without testicles. And this also agrees well with what Jesus is talking about here when he says that some people are made this way through castration. Others have been born this way through a birth defect or genetic disorder, or maybe even, for example, a double hernia. Boys even today are born with hernias, and back then it was untreatable. And if you had a double hernia, this could cause the testicles to remain undescended, and then they could atrophy or wither away. It also matches up real well with something called the dictionary. If you look at Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it agrees with me in the definition of what a eunuch actually is. But this is all par for the course when it comes to the homosexual agenda. They like to redefine words like marriage and gender and now eunuch, so it is no surprise when it suits their own sinful desires. So why in the world would Jesus then be talking about a eunuch? It's kind of a strange off-the-wall subject, but the reason is because it's all within the context of full devotion to God. And my friends, when you're talking about the Bible, context is everything. This little verse about eunuchs is sandwiched tightly between two other verses, verse 10 and then at the end of verse 12. And in those verses, Jesus is talking about people who have renounced marriage. In other words, they have decided to live a life of celibacy in total devotion to God. Now, it's not saying that every Christian is supposed to be celibate, but rather, for some, this is a higher calling. And he also just makes note of the fact that some people have even gone to the extreme of castrating themselves to either eliminate or minimize their sexual temptations. Again, not telling us to go out and castrate ourselves, but just a statement of fact of what some people have done in their endeavor to live a life of total devotion to God. And this matches fully with what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 32 through 35, where he talks about when a person is married, they find that their loyalties are divided. On the one hand, they have to spend time with the wife and the kids, and then they have what's left for their service and time with God. However, he says, for the unmarried individual, they can live a life of total devotion to God and His will and work. So this has nothing to do with making an allowance for same-sex or heterosexual marriage. Finally, some will actually admit that Jesus is talking about marriage between a male and a female. However, they will say, though, that Jesus, when he's talking about this, is only referring to the case of Adam and Eve, when there only was one man and one woman, where this was the only possible relationship that you could have. Now, first thing I would say, and it's kind of funny, that a lot of these people who say this, they don't even believe the story of Adam and Eve. So in other words, they're trying to argue their point based on something they don't even believe in. They're trying to undermine the very clear teachings of Jesus by pointing to an Old Testament fact that they don't even think is a fact. It just doesn't work that way, folks. The second thing that I would say is that, yes, Jesus is talking about the Old Testament story of creation when there was Adam and Eve, but then he takes that ideal and relates it to his current day. The point is this, that God's ideal is still the same for you and I. Marriage is between a man and a woman.